In March 2019, a 21-year-old woman arrived at a hospital in Slovenia with her left hand severed cleanly at the wrist. She told doctors it was a freak accident with a circular saw while trimming branches in the garden. But police quickly noticed one problem. Nobody had brought the hand. When they recovered it, surgeons were able to reattach it. But as investigators looked more closely at the bizarre incident, they found that nothing about it was accidental. The hand had been left behind on purpose and was a part of a scheme to turn a permanent injury into a €1 million insurance payout. Then detectives looked at the man beside her, her boyfriend, Sebastien Abramov. 4 years earlier, his previous girlfriend, Sara Veber, had been shot dead in what had also been called an accident. Slovenia is a small, high-income European Union country, tucked between Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Croatia, and home to just over 2 million people. It is also a place where murder is rare, about one killing a year for every 100,000 people. In 2015, 24-year-old Sara Veber lived with her family in Panovo Prijalku, a small settlement in the Savinja Valley. She was the only child of Nada and Rudi Veber, a daughter they had waited 8 years for. She had earned a physiotherapy diploma, and less than a month before her death she had started work at the University Rehabilitation Institute Socha. Colleagues remembered her as friendly, private, quick to greet people with a smile. Sara rarely discussed her personal life at work. At home, though, her parents had begun to sense that something was not right between Sara and her boyfriend, 25-year-old Sebastien Abramov. He had been seeing Sara for a few years, and the family had taken him in without reservation. Her father would later say he had accepted the young man as his own son. Sara and Sebastien had even been planning to set up an apartment for themselves upstairs in the Weber's house. He was polite and charismatic, a young man with a surprising range of interests. He even had a stint as a part-time motorcycle model, posing beside Harley-Davidsons in glossy photos. He also had a passion for firearms. He owned several handguns and a new semi-automatic rifle. That detail matters in Slovenia. Compared with the United States, Slovenia does not have the same broad, everyday gun culture. Civilian firearms exist there, especially for hunting and sport shooting, but access runs through a license system that requires registration, reliability checks, a medical examination, and a firearms handling exam. A young man with weapons was notable, but not automatically suspicious. To Sara's parents, Sebastien seemed at first like a perfectly normal boyfriend, if a bit enthusiastic about guns. On the evening of March 15th, 2015, Sara was at home in Pernovo with Sebastien and her family. It was a Sunday. Earlier that evening, she had been exercising on fitness equipment inside the house. Her parents briefly went to visit a nearby relative, and when they returned about 10 minutes later, Nada went to iron clothes, while Rudi headed to the shower. Sebastien was in the living room with one of his prized firearms, the semi-automatic rifle he'd acquired not long before. He had the weapon out in the open, which was unusual. According to Sara's mother, Sebastien never cleaned or tinkered with guns in the living areas. He usually did that in the furnace room or garage, away from the family's space. But that night, he had the rifle at hand in the living room, and he kept fiddling with it. He repeatedly complained aloud that the rifle was jamming and acting up, saying he needed to recock it over and over to fix a problem. Around 8 p.m., a sudden explosion echoed through the house. It was the crack of a gunshot, and it sent the household running toward the living room. Sara's mother dropped her ironing and ran toward the sound. There she was met with a scene of absolute dread. Sara was collapsed on the couch, unnaturally still, as if someone had gently placed her there. A red bloom of blood was spreading across her chest. Sebastien was standing nearby in a panic, blurting out that the rifle had fired on its own, and that Sara was dead. Nada Weber rushed to her daughter's side. Sara's eyes were closed, and her body limp. A single bullet had struck her directly in the chest, piercing her heart. She had no pulse. Nada desperately began CPR, pressing on her daughter's sternum, trying to force the heart to beat again. But it was no use. Sara had died within moments of the shot. In the chaos, Nada shouted for Sebastien to call an ambulance immediately. But Sebastien did not dial emergency services right away. Instead, as the frantic mother tried to revive her dying child, he took time to remove the rifle's magazine and lock the firearm back in its case. Only after doing all that did he start making phone calls, and the first number he dialed was not 112, the emergency line. Sebastien called a friend of his, a police officer named Marco Turk, to tell him what had happened. It was an odd choice in that critical moment. After speaking with his police acquaintance, Sebastien finally placed calls to the official emergency dispatcher and to a few other people. By the time paramedics and patrol officers pulled up at the Weber family home, several precious minutes had passed since the gunshot. The first responders found a traumatic but strangely composed scene. Sara Weber's body lay on the living room floor, with her mother Nada beside her, sobbing and exhausted from trying to resuscitate her. Her father Rudy was pale and shaking, having been woken by the gunfire. Sebastien was also in the room. According to one police officer, Sebastien was holding Sara's mother in an embrace when police entered. He appeared distraught. "The rifle just went off by itself," he kept repeating. "It was an accident." The officers noted the cased firearm and the spent shell casing ejected on the floor. It looked like a grotesque accident scene, a careless handling of a weapon that had ended in tragedy. That night, the police in Pernovo treated Sara's death as a fatal mishap. A criminal investigation was opened, but not for murder. Instead, officers worked under the assumption that this was an unintentional shooting, a case of negligent homicide. Slovenia does not have a high background level of gun violence, so investigators were not walking into the Weber home expecting a domestic murder disguised as a weapons accident. The scene looked tragic, strange, and careless. Sebastien gave a statement saying he had been cleaning the semi-automatic rifle when it misfired. He claimed he hadn't realized a round was in the chamber. Sara, he said, just had the terrible luck of standing nearby when the gun went off. In fact, Sebastien added a curious detail to his story. He said Sara had been holding the barrel of the gun herself in that moment, helping him as he tried to fix a jam, and that's why the bullet struck her directly. It was a far-fetched scenario, essentially suggesting that Sara unknowingly pointed the muzzle at her own chest while assisting him, but in the immediate aftermath of the incident, no one pressed him critically on it. There was no obvious evidence of a struggle or foul play at the scene. No one else was suspected. The only other witnesses were Sara's parents, who had not seen the shot occur. The family, reeling from shock, had trusted Sebastien and had no reason that night to accuse him of murder. Sara's body was taken for an autopsy. The pathologist observed the lethal gunshot wound to her right chest. It was a single, direct shot. There were no other major injuries on her body. No obvious bruises. No sign of a fight. The death was consistent with an accidental discharge at close range, at least on the surface. Forensic technicians did not perform a gunshot residue test on Sara's hands at the time. Such a test might have determined whether she had been holding the weapon's barrel or otherwise near the muzzle when it fired. But in a presumed accident, the procedure was apparently deemed unnecessary or was overlooked. Police investigators took photographs and collected the rifle, the spent cartridge, and other basic evidence from the scene. They filed a preliminary report classifying the case as a possible death by negligence. In practice, this meant Sebastien could face a charge for causing death due to careless handling of a firearm. But it was a much lesser offence than murder, carrying a far lighter sentence. And crucially, it implied that authorities did not believe he shot Sara intentionally. In the weeks that followed, Sara Veber was laid to rest. The funeral was heart-wrenching for the small community. Friends, neighbours, and family members came to mourn the energetic young woman whose life had been cut short so suddenly. Sebastien attended the funeral alongside Sara's grieving parents. According to witnesses, his behaviour at the service was strange. He wept loudly and even shouted dramatically, proclaiming that he was psychologically shattered and that he was taking medication just to cope. Some present thought his outbursts seemed excessive, almost performative. One relative later remarked that Sebastien was under such heavy tranquilizers at the funeral that he barely seemed in control of himself. At the time, most people saw his display as guilt-ridden anguish, the torment of a man who would have to live forever with the fact that his gun killed someone he loved. Sara's parents, Nada and Rudy, were too deep in grief to scrutinize Sebastien's demeanor. They accepted his tears and apologies at face value. After all, he had been practically part of their family. They believed he, too, was a victim of the tragic accident that took their daughter's life. In the eyes of the law, the matter did not completely vanish, but it also didn't immediately lead to serious punishment. Slovenian authorities did investigate the shooting, but nothing in those early months conclusively proved a crime beyond negligence. Sebastien remained free. No murder charge followed in 2015. Publicly, Sebastien Kolaric walked away with only the stigma of a horrible accident attached to his name. In reality, though, dark currents were swirling beneath the surface. Unbeknownst to Sara's family and friends, Sebastien had been living a double life. He had started a relationship with another woman as early as 2013, 2 years before Sara's death. While Sara believed Sebastien was her devoted boyfriend, he had quietly begun dating an 18-year-old named Julia Adlesic, who lived in Slovenia's capital city. Through 2014 and into 2015, Sebastien was courting Julia behind Sara's back. Neither woman knew of the other. Sebastien was leading a carefully compartmentalized existence. One part dutiful partner to Sara in her village, another part passionate suitor to Julia in the city. This duplicity would not fully come to light until years later, but it may explain a lot about Sebastien's state of mind in early 2015. By March of that year, his relationship with Sara was crumbling. Sara's mother had sensed that things weren't right. She noticed tension and distance, though Sara didn't confide any specifics. Possibly Sebastien was withdrawing, preparing to break away and pursue his new life with Julia. Evidence later suggested Sara herself had begun to suspect that Sebastien was unfaithful or hiding something. The exact conversations between them in those final days remain private, but investigators came to believe Sebastien Kolaric saw Sara as an obstacle by that point, an obstacle he decided to remove. After Sara's death, Sebastien wasted little time moving forward. He legally changed his last name to Abramov, adopting a slightly different persona in the years after 2015. With Sara gone, he openly continued his romance with Julia Adlesic. Julia was several years younger than him, and it seems she fell deeply under his influence. By her early 20s, Julia was living with Sebastien and even with his mother for a time. Sebastien painted himself to Julia's family as an enterprising, reliable man. Indeed, Julia's parents later testified that they found him polite. They had no inkling that Sebastien Abramov, as they knew him, had recently lost a girlfriend in a shooting incident. They certainly had no clue about his financial dealings or what he was capable of planning. For a few years, nothing about Sara Veber's death was officially questioned. It remained a closed chapter, a tragic memory in Panovo. But behind closed doors, Sara's parents still harbored quiet doubts and deep pain. They struggled to reconcile the accident story with odd details that nagged at them. Why had Sebastien been handling a loaded gun in the living room? Why did he put the weapon away instead of immediately helping Sara? Why did he phone a police friend before calling an ambulance? These questions lingered. Still, without evidence, there was little the family could do. They had watched Sebastien go unpunished in their daughter's death. It seemed that, accident or not, he would face no real reckoning. Then came the bizarre affair of the severed hand. On a winter day in early 2019, news broke of a shocking incident in Ljubljana. A young woman had sawn off her own hand in what looked like a deliberate insurance scam. The story dominated headlines in Slovenia. It was almost beyond comprehension. Very soon, the press named the people involved. The injured woman was Julia Adlesic, and her boyfriend, who was arrested as the alleged mastermind, was Sebastien Abramov. Sara's family recognized that name immediately. The realization hit them hard. The same man who had been in the room when their daughter was shot was now implicated in an outlandish crime for financial gain. The horror of that parallel was undeniable. If Sebastien could cook up a plan to mutilate Yulia for insurance money, what else was he capable of? Sara's relatives began to question everything about the so-called accident in 2015. The question that had once seemed almost unthinkable now became unavoidable. Had the police gotten it wrong back then? Had Sarah's death never been an accident at all? They were not alone in this re-evaluation. Detectives in the Chelye Regional Police also took a renewed interest in the old case. In light of Abramov's apparent willingness to endanger Yulia for profit, investigators suspected that Sara Veber's death might have been a calculated murder. In April 2019, just weeks after the severed hand incident, Slovenian police quietly reopened the Sara Veber file. What they found would transform the narrative of Sara's death. The renewed investigation began from scratch, as if the shooting had happened yesterday. Crime scene evidence was re-examined with fresh eyes. Forensic specialists reanalyzed the ballistics of the shot that killed Sara. With more advanced techniques and a determination to leave no doubt, they reconstructed the positioning of the shooter and the victim. A joint team of a forensic pathologist and a ballistic expert was appointed to produce a fresh expert report for the case. They worked through the autopsy findings, crime scene photographs, and the physics of the gunshot. Their conclusions were damning for Sebastien Abramov. Sara Veber's wound and the surrounding evidence did not support the gun-cleaning accident story at all. According to the forensic analysis later presented in court, Sara had been shot from a distance of roughly 80 to 200 centimeters, 2 to 6 feet away. This immediately undercut Sebastien's claim that Sara was holding the barrel of the gun when it fired. If she had been gripping the muzzle, the shot would have been at point-blank range, leaving telltale powder burns on her skin. Instead, the evidence showed the muzzle was well away from her body. Moreover, the trajectory was horizontal and level, suggesting that the shooter had aimed straight at her chest. The experts determined that at the moment she was struck, Sara was in a half-seated position, perhaps in the act of rising from the couch. Crucially, her right arm was outstretched in front of her. The forensic team interpreted that detail as a likely defensive gesture. Sara had her arm raised because she might have seen the gun pointed toward her, and in that split second tried either to shield herself or push the barrel away. In other words, far from innocently holding the gun as a helper, Sara appeared to have been reacting in fear to a threat. This forensic re-evaluation painted a clear picture. Sara Veber was shot deliberately at mid-range, while she was at least partially seated and off guard. There was no mechanical defect found in the rifle either. Tests showed the weapon was functioning normally, without the mysterious jamming problem Sebastien had described. Meanwhile, detectives also dug into the digital and testimonial evidence that had been overlooked or undervalued in 2015. They confiscated Sebastien's phone and computer records from around the time of Sara's death. What they found were inconsistencies in his story and hints of premeditation. For instance, they discovered that days before the shooting, Sebastien had been telling people that something was wrong with his rifle, that it wasn't working properly and kept jamming. He had essentially been laying the groundwork for a mechanical failure excuse. Sara's mother confirmed this. She recalled Sebastien harping on the rifle's problems constantly on the very day of the incident. Investigators also noted that Sebastien never normally cleaned guns in the living room, as Sara Veber emphasized. Doing so that night was an abrupt departure from his usual behavior. Investigators interviewed over 80 witnesses as they re-investigated. Many were re-interviews of family and friends, but police also identified new witnesses who had relevant information. Among them were Yulia Adlishic's parents, who provided a startling timeline. By their account, Sebastien had begun courting their daughter Yulia in 2013. This meant that for the last 2 years of Sara's life, Sebastien had simultaneously been involved with Yulia, a fact that Sara's family had never known. To detectives, this established a potential motive. Sebastien wanted to free himself to be with Yulia. Sara may also have been pressing him about the money he owed her family. It emerged that Sebastien had financially entangled himself with the Webers. At one point, he convinced Sara's mother to take out a bank loan of about €15,000, approximately $17,000, on his behalf, ostensibly to help him buy a car. He never repaid that loan. Sara's mother eventually took him to civil court over that debt and won. By 2018, Sebastien had been convicted of fraud for the loan scheme and ordered to pay it back. All these threads pointed to a man who used people, for money and for convenience, and discarded them when they were no longer useful. To the Slovenian police, the pattern was now unmistakable. Sebastien's modus operandi was manipulation and self-interest. They concluded that Sara Veber had been a victim of this pattern. Investigators publicly stated that Sebastien had successfully manipulated those close to him in 2015, deceiving Sara's family and authorities into believing the shooting was accidental. He had almost gotten away with murder. In April 2019, authorities made their move. Sebastien Abramov, already under arrest in the severed hand insurance case, was now formally charged with the murder of Sara Veber. Police and prosecutors announced that new evidence and witness statements justified an indictment for intentional, premeditated homicide in the 2015 incident. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and Sebastien's murder trial did not commence until several years later. He remained in custody in the interim, partly due to the unrelated fraud convictions that were piling up, and partly because the severity of the murder charge required it. By early 2020, Sebastien and his accomplices, including Julia Adlicic, were convicted in the severed hand insurance fraud. Julia was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and Abramov received a 3-year prison term for his role in that gruesome scam. As that sensational case concluded, public attention turned fully to the looming murder trial. Slovenians were astonished as details trickled out. Many had difficulty fathoming that the same man at the center of the hand-severing fraud might also have staged a fatal accident years before. The press dubbed Sebastien a uniquely dangerous con artist. In media, he was described as a master manipulator, even a psychopath devoid of empathy. Every development was closely followed by the public. The murder trial of Sebastien Abramov finally opened in the courthouse of Celje in 2022, 7 years after Sara's death. The proceedings were long and often emotional. Sara's family sat in the courtroom, forced to relive the worst night of their lives, listening to forensic experts and witnesses dissect what happened. It is worth pausing briefly on the courtroom itself. Slovenia does not use a separate 12-person jury for this kind of case. Serious criminal cases in district courts can be heard by a mixed panel of professional judges and lay judges, so the people weighing the evidence were members of the court panel itself, not jurors in a separate box. Sebastien, now in his early 30s, appeared mostly calm and detached. Reporters noted that he often watched the trial impassively, sometimes even leaving the courtroom early on various pretexts. But he was present to hear the parade of evidence that methodically dismantled his original story. Sara's parents also took the stand, one after the other, to share what they remembered and what they had realized over time. She told the judges about Sebastien's strange actions and recalled that Sebastien had never before fixed guns in the living room. The night of the shooting was the first and last time. She also mentioned that it was unusual for Sara to skip her post-gym shower and go straight to the living room that night, raising the possibility that Sebastien had called Sara over on some pretext instead of letting her follow her routine. Sara's father testified that Sebastien owned a small arsenal of firearms and was very familiar with their use. He confirmed that the rifle that killed Sara was practically new and that there was no legitimate reason for it to fire accidentally if handled properly. If anything, Rudy implied, Sebastien had to have been grossly negligent or intentionally reckless for such a thing to occur. And nothing about Sebastien's prior behavior with guns suggested he was merely clumsy. Another relative testified that Sebastien was quite adept with weapons and would be unlikely to make such a mistake. During the trial, intriguing side stories emerged as well. It came to light that Sebastien Abramov had a cozy relationship with at least one police officer, the very friend he called right after the shooting. That officer, Marco Turk, was called to testify. He was asked about his connection to Sebastien, and why Sebastien might have rung him first before emergency services. Turk testified that he and Sebastien were casual friends, and that Sebastien occasionally volunteered as an independent witness for police searches, an unusual arrangement where Sebastien, as a civilian, would accompany Turk's police unit to observe house search procedures for the record. This revelation raised eyebrows in court, hinting that Sebastien had ingratiated himself with law enforcement figures. However, there was no evidence of outright collusion or cover-up by the police. It seemed Sebastien's deception had simply been effective in those first hours and days. As the trial progressed, Sebastien mostly sat in silence. When he did speak, it was to insist on his innocence. At one point, he made a peculiar statement to the court. "I have never run away from responsibility for Sara's death, but I did not kill her." He portrayed himself as someone unfairly maligned by media. In a dramatic flourish, he asserted that if he truly were a psychopath, then I shouldn't be in prison but in a psychiatric hospital. These outbursts did little to sway the court. They may even have reinforced the prosecution's image of Sebastien as a manipulative, self-centered character. His defense attorney, Dusan Tanko, intimated that the prosecution's narrative was built on circumstantial inference. He brought up witnesses who recalled Sara playfully tugging at guns in the past, a rather far-fetched attempt to suggest Sara might have grabbed the rifle muzzle herself for some reason. This line of defense, however, struggled against the sheer consistency of evidence against Sebastien. No one could deny that Sebastien had lied about many aspects. He said he hadn't realized a bullet was chambered. Yet he admittedly disabled the safety catch on the rifle moments before the shot. He claimed he didn't see that Sara was hit because there was no blood, hence he put the gun away innocently, an excuse that seemed absurd given that Sara collapsed immediately with a massive wound. In July 2023, the Chelier District Court delivered its verdict. Sebastien Abramov was found guilty of the murder of Sara Veber. For the crime of murder, Abramov was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Given his other convictions in the interim, the court merged his sentences into a single 30-year term to account for the insurance fraud and earlier fraud offences. This is an exceptionally long sentence by Slovenian standards, reflecting the severity and premeditation of the murder. Sebastien was not in the courtroom to hear his fate. He had requested to be excused before the verdict was read. Perhaps he knew what was coming. As the judges announced the guilty verdict and the sentence, Sara's mother quietly wept. It had taken more than 8 years, but at last they heard the word murder officially attached to what happened to Sara. Sebastien's defense immediately filed an appeal, but in June 2024, the Slovenian High Court upheld the murder conviction. They made a slight adjustment, reducing the murder sentence from 27 to 26 years, citing perhaps some technical or procedural reason. With the additional fraud sentences, Abramov's effective prison term became 29 years. He will be behind bars well into his late middle age, if not his old age. For the Weber family, the final appellate decision in 2024 brought a measure of closure. Sebastien Abramov, the man who had walked into their home as Sara's boyfriend and left as her killer, was at last being held accountable. Sara Veber's memory now lives on, untarnished by the initial verdict of accident. It is clear for all of Slovenia to see that she did not die by a random twist of fate on that March evening in 2015. She was the victim of a cold-blooded murder, perpetrated by someone she trusted.